Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a story filled with tension and heartbreak. What would you do if the family you returned to suddenly forced you to prove your own child with a DNA test, even when it could risk everything? Stay with me to uncover what happens next. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. Living in the CEO's house was nothing like Tieu Lac had imagined. Not warm, not safe, not even neutral. It was suffocating. From the moment she woke up in the morning to the moment she closed her eyes at night, there was always a feeling lingering in the air, like she was being watched, measured, silently judged. The house was quiet, too quiet, but beneath that silence was tension, heavy, unspoken. Every step she took across the polished floor felt like it echoed louder than it should. Every movement, every glance, every breath felt like it didn't belong there. She had returned thinking she was choosing courage, but now it felt like she had walked into a place that was slowly breaking her down from the inside. Breakfast was the worst. The long dining table, the cold arrangement of plates, the distance between people who were technically family, but felt like strangers. Tieu Lac sat quietly, her hands resting gently on her belly. The baby had been more active lately. Sometimes it kicked softly, as if reacting to her emotions. And this morning, it wouldn't stop moving, as if it could feel her unease. Across from her, the CEO's mother sat perfectly straight, sipping tea with slow, controlled movements. She didn't look at Tieu Lac immediately. She never did. She always waited, as if choosing the exact moment to speak. "You haven't been eating well." Her voice cut through the silence, calm but sharp. Tieu Lac looked up slightly. "I'm fine." A small pause. Then, "You shouldn't lie in this house." The words were soft, but deliberate. The CEO, sitting beside Tieu Lac, put his chopsticks down. "Mom," but again she raised her hand, stopping him without even looking at him. Her eyes finally shifted to Tieu Lac. Direct, cold. "If you want to stay here," she said slowly, "then we need clarity." Tieu Lac felt her fingers tighten. Clarity. She already knew what was coming. "I want a DNA test." The room froze. Even the air seemed to stop moving. The CEO's expression darkened instantly. "That's not necessary." His voice was firm, but his mother didn't react. "It is." Her tone didn't rise, but it didn't need to. "Not for me," she added. "For this family." Her eyes moved briefly to Tieu Lac's belly, then back to her face. "We don't accept uncertainty." Tieu Lac felt something inside her chest tighten. It wasn't shock, not anymore. It was something deeper, a quiet pain that had been building, finally taking shape. "I won't do it." Her voice was steady, but soft. The CEO turned to her. "Tieu Lac." She shook her head slightly. "I won't." Her hand moved protectively over her belly. "I'm not putting my child through anything unnecessary." The CEO's mother let out a small breath, almost like disappointment. "Unnecessary?" She stood up slowly. "Then perhaps you misunderstand your position here." The word position lingered, heavy. "You are here because my son brought you here," she continued, "not because you belong here." Silence. Tieu Lac lowered her gaze, not in submission, but in restraint. Because she knew, if she said anything now, it would only make things worse. Later that morning, the CEO left for work. Before leaving, he stood in front of Tieu Lac, his expression softer than usual. "Don't worry about what she said." His hand gently touched hers. "I'll handle it." Tieu Lac nodded, but she didn't say anything, because deep down, she knew this wasn't something he could simply handle. This was his mother, his family, his world, and she was still an outsider. The house felt even colder after he left. The silence stretched longer, heavier. Tieu Lac stayed in her room for most of the morning, sitting by the window, watching the trees sway slightly in the wind. Her hand rested on her belly again. The baby had calmed down, but she hadn't. Her thoughts kept circling back. The words, the doubt, the look in the CEO's mother's eyes. Not anger, not even hatred, but something more cutting. Disbelief, as if Tieu Lac's existence itself didn't make sense in that world. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Before she could respond, the door opened. The CEO's mother stepped in, elegant, composed, as always. "We're going out." Tieu Lac frowned slightly. "Where?" The answer came immediately. "To the hospital." The room went still. "I said no," Tieu Lac replied quietly. The older woman walked further in, each step controlled, each movement deliberate. "This is not a request." Her voice remained calm. "But it is a decision." Tieu Lac stood up slowly. Her body felt heavier now, but her eyes steady. "I'm not going." A pause, then, "Are you afraid?" The question came softly, but it cut deep. Tieu Lac's breath caught for just a second, not because the words were loud, but because they were precise. "You're afraid the result won't match your story?" "No." The answer came immediately, stronger this time. "I'm afraid of anything that could harm my child." The CEO's mother studied her for a moment, long, silent, then she turned slightly. "As you wish." She began walking toward the door, but just before leaving, she stopped. However, Tieu Lac's heart tightened. "If you refuse, then you won't stay here." The door closed behind her, softly, but the sound echoed. Loud, final. The afternoon dragged on slowly, every minute felt heavier than the last. Tieu Lac sat alone in the room, her mind racing. Stay or leave? The same question again, the same crossroads, but this time it wasn't just about her, it was about the child. She placed both hands over her belly. The baby moved gently, as if responding. "I'm here," she whispered, but her voice trembled slightly, because for the first time since coming back, she felt uncertain again, not about him, not about love, but about this place, this house, this world that didn't want her. Evening came, the CEO returned. The moment he stepped into the room, he sensed it. Something had changed. What happened? Tieu Lac looked at him. There was no anger in her eyes, no tears, just distance. "She asked me to leave." The words were simple, but heavy. His expression hardened instantly. "What?" "She said if I don't take the DNA test, I can't stay here." Silence. The air between them shifted, something darker, more serious. Because now, it was no longer just tension. It was a line, drawn clearly, between two sides. The CEO turned away slightly, his jaw tightening. "I'll talk to her." But this time, Tieu Lac shook her head. "No." He looked back at her, confused. "If this is the condition, then I need to decide." A pause. "And you do too." Her voice was calm but firm, because deep down, she already knew. This wasn't just about a test, it was about dignity, trust, and whether love was strong enough to stand between two worlds. That night, the house felt even more suffocating than before. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting for a decision, for a confrontation, for something that would change everything. And somewhere deep inside, Tieu Lac felt it. A storm was coming, and this time, it wouldn't be easy to survive. Tieu Lac struggles to live in the CEO's house, where every day feels tense, cold, and suffocating. Instead of acceptance, she faces constant suspicion from the CEO's mother, who demands a DNA test if Tieu Lac wants to remain in the family home. While the CEO promises to protect her, things worsen after he leaves for work. His mother takes control and pressures Tieu Lac to go to the hospital. But Tieu Lac refuses, fearing any procedure could harm her unborn child. Her refusal leads to an even harsher ultimatum: take the test or leave the house. Caught between dignity, fear, and the safety of her baby, Tieu Lac begins to question whether returning was a mistake. As the pressure grows, the CEO must face an impossible choice between standing by the woman he loves or obeying his mother's demands.